is muted and your video is off, so it'll just be people being able to see my screen. There is a chat box as well, so I want you to take a sec and make sure you can find that and you know how to use it. If there are any questions throughout this, feel free to throw that chat question up there if you need something clarified or you don't understand. And then we're also going to have some time at the end for some question and answer. So this should be under an hour, but if we have a great discussion going, we will go all the way up to the hour mark. So yeah, just a quick introduction to me. My name is Dalaina May, and I am the Executive Director of Dark Bali. And Dark Bali is an organization that seeks to see sex slavery abolished and the broken lives of survivors restored through creating awareness, empowering advocacy, and building partnerships for the prevention, rescue, and restoration of trafficked children in Bali and throughout Indonesia. So yes, we primarily work in Indonesia, and I'm American though, as you can tell, so a lot of overlap in both places. But Dark Bali serves as a coalition of small grassroots organizations that are focused on anti-trafficking in Indonesia. So we're helping to create networks, facilitating collaboration, providing access to resources and training, and contributing to research and data collection. So that's kind of the space that we're coming from. And as everybody has been self-isolating because of coronavirus, we were chatting as a team, and one of the ideas that came up was, well, you know, we have musicians that are giving their music, and authors are reading books, and different people are putting their skill sets online, and maybe we should put ours online too. So we decided to try and do that, and obviously talking about human trafficking and related topics. So this is actually going to be the first webinar in a series of webinars. The next ones will be at the same time, same Zoom link for the next 3 weeks after this, and we'll be talking about trauma. I'm getting into that pretty deep over the next 2 weeks. And then the final week that we have scheduled at this point is talking specifically about boys and how we see them showing up in the human trafficking data. And if these webinars go well, then we'll just keep scheduling and see how it goes. So a few housekeeping things. I want to first say that this is a hard topic. It's hard for a lot of people. It's hard for me. And we really want you to listen to your own body and your own emotions. And if you decide, you know what, I cannot do this, I need to tap out, that's okay. If you need to mute a certain slide or get up and go get a drink of water and come back, that's fine. Like I said, it is being recorded, so you can feel free to access it at a later date. If you just decide, you know what, today I just can't even deal with this, that's okay. So take good care of yourself. That's the most important thing. And then next, we want to set just some plans and objectives so you know what to expect over the next hour. What we're hoping that you get out of this is that you come to be able to understand and even be able to explain what the international definitions of human trafficking are, you know, where their definitions come from, and you can kind of break it down. We want to talk about vulnerability factors. Why is it that somebody is trafficked and this other person isn't? What are the things that increase a person's vulnerability? We're also going to get into discussing the topic of grooming and how a trafficker is able to exploit somebody and control somebody. And that process is called grooming. And then even just knowing what are the different kinds of trafficking. A lot of times when you say human trafficking, different people will have different ideas in their head about what that means. And so just want to expand your horizons on that. If you don't already know these forms, you might learn, oh, well, that's a kind of trafficking I'd never heard about before. So this is a very introductory. Again, if you have any questions, if I'm moving too quickly, if something gets lost in translation, go ahead and send me a chat. And if you have questions kind of more broadly, we'll hit those at the end of the seminar. So let's get started on definitions. So this is a really overwhelming slide to look at. It's really big, it looks really scary. So don't freak out, we're actually going to break it down a little bit in the next slide. But for this one, what I want you to know is this is the international definition of human trafficking. It's called the Palermo Protocol, and it was developed by the United Nations a number of years ago. And what the protocols mean is basically the UN will put out this protocol, and each country has to decide whether or not to ratify it, and will they ratify all of it or will they ratify part of it. And once it's ratified in whole or in part, then that country will then make national laws based on whatever they've ratified. So a lot of countries, especially countries like the US, countries in Europe and Australia, have ratified this as a whole. There are other countries like Indonesia that have only ratified it in part, and we'll get into a little bit about how that's different and why that matters in a minute. But what I just want you to know is this is an internationally accepted definition. It is the definition of trafficking that all the organizations in the sector really work with when they're trying to decide who is and who isn't a trafficking survivor. And then for the purpose of law enforcement, they're looking at their national laws, whether or not they can prosecute. And most of those are based on this protocol as well. So let's break this sucker down. It is really big and really scary. But what the Palermo Protocol has is 3 different parts. So you have the acts, and then you have the means, and then you have the purpose. In order to prove trafficking, you must have one item from each of these 3 categories. You must have one act, one means, one purpose. So the acts are basically what's happening. What is the act that's taking place? The means are how does it happen? And the purpose is why it happens. So you have to prove what and why and how to prove trafficking for an adult. And I think it's really important that you understand that it is just one. One of the myths of trafficking is that trafficking is just about transferring somebody from one country to another, to cross the border with somebody in order to exploit them. And while that is certainly trafficking, it is by no means all of trafficking. Trafficking can happen in a single town. Trafficking can happen in a home. And I kind of joke a little bit about how Cinderella is actually a trafficking survivor. But if you look at this definition, she really is. She was at one point in her story harbored in her own home. She was kept there under the threat and use of force. She was locked in and she was exploited for service. So that is a way that somebody could be trafficked even in their own home if they are forced into slavery-like situations under threat or coercion, even if they are only harbored and are never transported or transferred. You also should know that it is very, very rare that the same person recruits a victim and also transfers them and harbors and exploits them. It's usually a chain of people. And the reason why it's important that this is a recruited or harbored or transported list is that we want each person in that chain to be held accountable for what they've done. So for example, if there is a recruiter that has recruited somebody somehow by deception, let's say, and has plans to put them into forced labor, but maybe it gets disrupted along the lines and that person never actually ends up into forced labor, we can still prosecute that person as a trafficker because they had done that with the intent, right? There was a purpose for their recruitment. So we want everybody to be held accountable along that chain. Another really important caveat is those 2 asterisks there on the means. This definition is true for adults, but for minors under the Palermo Protocol, we don't actually have to prove the means. We have to prove what happened, the act, and we have to prove why it happened, but we don't actually have to prove how. We don't have to prove that there's been force or coercion or deception. We just have to say that this child was recruited or transported or harbored or received in order to be exploited for labor, for sexual exploitation, things like that. And there's a few reasons for this. One is simply that we recognize in terms of sex trafficking that a child really doesn't have the cognitive ability or the responsibility to make that kind of a choice. To choose to consent to sexual services doesn't make sense for a child. Because it goes back to that abuse of power, which is actually within the means. There's an abuse of power, there's always an adult involved in something like that. And so for children, we really only have to prove the act and the purpose according to the Palermo Protocol. And if you paid attention to different anti-human trafficking organizations, you'll see that a lot of them focus on children. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One reason is, I mean, they're kids and we want to care about kids. We want to care about the most vulnerable. But another part of it is it's actually just a lot easier to prove that human trafficking has happened with a 17-year-old than an 18-year-old. And it's ridiculous because there's nothing magical that happens when somebody turns 18, but legally it's so much easier to prove that this person was exploited without having to prove whether or not they were consenting, whether or not there was coercion. That's a really hard thing to prove. So if I want to prosecute a trafficker, I want to go after somebody that's also trafficking kids, because if I can get that kid's case seen and prove that that kid has been trafficked and shut that person down, then anybody else that that person's trafficking is also protected and can also be taken care of. But it's going to be easier for me to just prove that with a child rather than with an adult. Now, I mentioned that Indonesia had some different laws. This is one area where Indonesia has not actually adopted the Palermo Protocol as it exists with most countries. They don't have this differentiation between adults and children. So even for children in Indonesia, we have to prove that that there's been coercion and that there's no consent. So that can make things a lot more difficult, at least in our context. So I'm going to assume that that's clear. I don't see anybody chatting anything, so we'll assume that that is really clear for you. So now that you have kind of the definition and the broad picture of what human trafficking is, it's this act coupled with a means, somehow it's being done for these purposes. Let's move into different kinds of trafficking, and we'll kind of just talk through those as well. So different types of human trafficking. We've mentioned a few of these already, and let me just move my chat box so I can actually see my list. There we go. So for sex trafficking, that's a lot of times what people have in their heads when they hear human trafficking. So that is the exploitation of sexual services, whether it is cyber sex, whether it's prostitution, whether it's pornography being made, but those are sexual services. So those are all considered sex trafficking. Another type of trafficking is child soldiers. And this is kind of similar to the idea of children involved in sex work. We recognize that children really should not be consenting and really cannot really consent to being conscripted into the military. We recognize that children should not be making that choice and that there's always adults involved in that decision. And so whenever you have a child being put into military service, that's considered a form of human trafficking, trafficking that child. And, you know, different places have more or less of different kinds of trafficking going on. So the child soldiering we see in different parts of Africa and Asia. In our context, in Bali, where the organization started, it's a major hub for child sex tourism, a lot like Bangkok. So we really see a ton of sex trafficking, but there are a lot of other kinds as well. So another one is forced marriage. That should not be happening. People should not be forced to marry other people. And we recognize when there is no consent in a marriage relationship, and that act, means, and purpose goes through, that can be considered a form of trafficking. Child marriage can be considered a form of trafficking as well. And it might interest a lot of people. I didn't know this until I started studying the topic, that a lot of countries in the world that we would not expect actually don't have minimum age laws for marriage. The United States, most states don't have minimum age laws that are set in stone. There's a lot of like, oh, if your parents sign off on it or a religious leader or something like that, then a kid can get married. And child marriage in and of itself can be considered a form of trafficking, but it also often leads to other forms of trafficking. And labor trafficking, this is a big, big, big beast that encompasses a lot. This is where the majority of the numbers are at. And this is just labor for, or trafficking for labor. So I put up a few industries there that we just know that there's a lot of trafficking happening. Things like fishing and logging, construction, mining. And as you would guess, this is actually predominantly a male group that is being trafficked for these things. And a lot of times this looks like deception. They come to work and they end up not getting paid. And they end up maybe having their documents taken and now they can't even leave. We also have things like servitude. So domestic servitude would be where you have a victim who is recruited to work as a domestic help, like a housekeeper or nanny or something like that. And maybe she's from the US or the Philippines, and she is taken to Saudi Arabia as a really common destination, or maybe Singapore, and her documents are taken, and now she's stuck in this person's house, and she is there maybe illegally now, or she's worried she's there illegally. She doesn't speak the language. She's not getting paid. She may be getting exploited in other ways while she's at this home. And that's a form of servitude that we see all over the place. And then another interesting one is forced begging. So if you've traveled or been somewhere where you've had a kid come up to your window and ask for money, I think a lot of times we want to think, oh, they're just a poor kid and they're just trying to get some money for their family. And I wish that was true, but that's not usually true. usually what we see is that there's a syndicate that's running the kids. So to give you an example, a couple of years ago, I was in Indonesia and had to run into a 7-Eleven. And when I went in, there was a couple of little girls. One was like 6, one was 8-ish. And because I know that there's often an adult running the program and collecting the money, I never give money to kids like that. But a lot of times I'll buy like some sort of food, and I'll open the package so it can't be resold. And that's a way I can feel like I can do something for them without endangering them or helping out the traffickers. So anyway, I bought whatever it was I went to get and picked up a couple of bottles of milk and then opened them up. And as I was leaving, I said something to the girls and gave them each some milk. And then I went back to my car and just sat there because I wanted to see what they would do. And sure enough, they walked over to the far corner of the parking lot, this fancy car, and the driver's side window rolls down, and this woman's hand reaches out, and she had like a really nice watch and jewelry, and she takes the bottles of milk and points back to the door, and then the window rolls up, and the girls went back to begging. So obviously these are kids that are being exploited for labor, and they're certainly being coerced into doing it. And oftentimes street kids or kids that are begging are also being exploited in other ways. So we do see that happening. And then debt bondage. Debt bondage is a really interesting one as well. And it happens in different ways in different places. We see it quite a bit in Indonesia. But one way that it shows up is in India at like brick kilns where they make bricks. You'll have a brick kiln owner who forms kind of an indentured servitude agreement with a family. So maybe a story would be how a daughter needs her dowry paid for. And so the father goes to this brick kiln owner and says, hey, I will work for you. I'll be indebted to you, and me and my wife can work off that debt. Can we form a contract? And likely this person doesn't have much education, so the contract is made. But what he doesn't realize is that the interest rates are so high on it that he's actually going to become more and more in debt as time passes. And so maybe by a few years later, he's brought his other daughter into this. And so now the whole family is enslaved to this company or this brick kiln owner. And what's really tragic about that is how if they have more children while they're bonded to this person, those children are actually born as slaves and are born as property of this brick kiln. So that's a form of debt bondage. We see something similar that shows up in the brothels in Bali a lot. And I'll give you guys a story about that in a little bit. But all that kind of gets put underneath the labor trafficking category. And then finally, organ trafficking. And this one is nasty. It is a form of trafficking that is so tragic because very few people survive it. It is exactly what it sounds like. This is when a person is trafficked and their vital organs are removed to be used in transplants, obviously without their consent, because nobody would consent to do that. And so where this has shown up most recently is in China. There has been documented cases by state departments and governments around the world of the Uyghur population being used for organ trafficking by the Chinese government. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority in China, and they've been in concentration camps for the last number of years. And it's been pretty recently well documented that the Chinese government is actually killing them to take their organs to use in transplant around the country. So really, really nasty. But that is a form of trafficking, and all of these fall under that Palermo protocol that you saw in the earlier slides. So definitely want everyone to be aware of how all this is. So the next question that we want to tackle is why this person and not that person? Why is this person more likely to be trafficked than somebody else? And so what these are called is push factors and pull factors. Let me move slide. There we go. So a push factor is something that is true about the person that's being exploited. This is something about them personally. A pull factor is something that's true about their environment that makes them more likely to be trafficked. So there's no way to say, oh, this person's definitely going to get trafficked. That's not a thing. What we can do is look at the data from our survivors or people that have been victimized by trafficking and go, wow, so many of these people share this thing in common, or so many of these people have this in common in their environment. Now, to back up with that, you have to also realize you can have every single one of these true, but it doesn't mean you're going to be trafficked. It's just a more likelihood, if that makes sense. So looking through some of these that are really significant, I've underlined childhood sexual abuse. That's probably the key push factor as we look at data about people that have been particularly involved in sex trafficking. There was a study done that indicated that sexually abused children are 28 times more likely to be arrested for prostitution at some point in their lives than their peers who weren't abused. And for me, I've worked in Indonesia, worked in red light districts, sat in brothels with a lot of victims as they were being victimized, worked quite a bit in aftercare context there. And then also back here in the US, more recently involved in Orange County, California's anti-human trafficking task force and working with survivors here. So I've heard a lot of stories, and I don't know that there are very many that I've heard that did not also involve a history of childhood sexual abuse. It's just a big, big part of this story. Other things that show up, particularly in Western contexts, are foster kids. Kids that are wards of the state are very, very, very vulnerable. In Orange County, the most recent report, it really surprised me. I mean, I knew it was high, but 100% of the minors that were involved in care by the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, 100% of them were involved in the juvenile justice system in some way, either as foster kids or as juvenile delinquents. So that's a huge, huge vulnerable population. And obviously that connects with runaways and homelessness. But if you think like a trafficker, which, I mean, you kind of have to learn to do in this work, it makes sense. If I want to target somebody and I want to get somebody to be a property and a product that I can sell, I'm going to try to find somebody that is not connected to people that will go looking for them. I want to find somebody who can disappear and nobody will notice. And so you find these sorts of people being the most vulnerable, or people that can't say what's happening if they're being exploited. So that's why you see people that have disabilities often more likely to be exploited. People that don't have their identity documents. So if they are a refugee or they're an immigrant, if they're somewhere illegally, they're way more vulnerable because they can't report, because they might get sent out of the country, they might get deported. So different things like that are all push factors. So there's something about the person that makes them more likely to be trafficked. And then you have the pull factors. And again, pull factors are the things about the environment. So obviously coronavirus is up there on top, and I wanted to spend a minute talking about that because I know that's really relevant, obviously, for where we're at right now. And I've had a lot of questions. Well, how does this impact trafficking? And even I've had a conversation with somebody who was like, oh, it's good, right? Like you can't have like prostitution and brothels open if everybody's, you know, self-isolating. And I'm like, well, yeah, but no. So yes, it might be that a brothel closes because there's nobody going in, but those people aren't going to be sent home. They're still considered and being treated like property of the traffickers. What we do see happening is just like we're going online and we're adapting to this new normal. That's what's happening among trafficking victims in the trafficking industry as well. They're going online. There was an article released I think yesterday or the day before by Reuters that was talking about how cyber sex crime has just gone way up. Again, if they have this product, they're going to figure out a way to sell it. And so cyber sex crimes have been going up. And so, and that's a subset of sex trafficking. It's basically where somebody is sexually abused in front of a webcam. And then there's somebody on the other side paying for it and even sometimes directing what it is that they're seeing. And sadly, this is something that we see with very, very small children, infants and toddlers even. And so that is something that we see kind of booming right now in our sector. But just like with any natural disaster, if you have a tsunami or you have an earthquake and all of a sudden a bunch of people are displaced, a bunch of people have lost their jobs, a bunch of people maybe have lost their families, a bunch of people all of a sudden incur huge debts like needing to rebuild their homes, or their parents are in the hospital sick with coronavirus and they need money, they've now become vulnerable. And when they become vulnerable, there are people that will figure out a way to exploit that vulnerability. So that's what we expect to see with coronavirus. Obviously, time will tell, and we're watching. And organizations like Dark Bali, that's a coalition of a lot of organizations. We're doing the work of asking people, okay, what are you seeing in your town? What are you seeing in your city? What's happening with the victim population there? Are brothels closing? Do you see it moving in other ways? And so we have to gather the data. But we do know from looking from past history, so there's been some studies done like with the Ebola virus a couple of years ago, and it pretty much followed that same pattern of a disruption followed by the ability to kind of check and move and change, and actually an increase in trafficking. So that is definitely something. And then even kind of mentioned a couple of times, access to technology is a huge one. As people have been more accessible, they are accessed by predators. I was talking with a colleague recently, and he is this amazing retired detective who worked in child sex trafficking for years and years and years, and is still involved in anti-trafficking. And he was telling me the other day, I would rather put a loaded handgun in the hand of a middle school child than a cell phone. And I was like, well, I've got a middle school son. I totally agree in a lot of ways. So the ability to access a child, especially with technology, is a really significant factor. A lot of recruitment is happening through social media. People are meeting predators online, and that's how it's happening. Different things, lack of laws or laws that aren't used really well. Some places like Indonesia have pretty decent laws when all is said and done. There's some issues, but actually implementing those laws, if they're not being implemented, they don't really help. And so if I'm a trafficker and I have a choice between this person over here or this person over here, and this person is in a law where or a country where law enforcement is serious and they're looking and they're prosecuting, or I can go do something over here with this group of people in a place where the laws aren't even being followed, the police aren't really active, and I don't see prosecutions happening. Well, if I'm smart, I'm going to go over here and access that second group. And then finally, another one to mention is our gender ratios. So I don't know if people have heard about the Chinese one-child law. They just terminated that. But for about a generation, they had this one-child law where people were only allowed to have one kid. And because of the cultural preferences for males, about 1 million girls were either aborted or were killed as newborn infants so that the family could have a boy child. And what this led to was a very messed up ratio between men and women. And so now that those boys have grown up and they're looking for spouses, there's 1 million women missing out of that eligible wife category. And so what has been happening recently in places like China, and it's the same in India, is they're trafficking women from other countries to serve as wives. So there's a ton of bride trafficking from places like Thailand and different parts of Southeast Asia, Myanmar into China, and then also from Indian villages into Indian cities to replace the women that are missing. So that's a huge pull factor in those areas. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of different stories that we have, especially talking about sex trafficking in particular, just because that's my area of expertise. You have a really different story sometimes between an American or a Western victim and a victim in a majority world context like Indonesia. And I know that most of the people that are listening, this is in English, and so they're coming from Western countries. I think we have Australia, we have the UK, some people on here from the US. And so I want to give you guys a more typical story. And this story was put out by Shared Hope International. I put the website on the next slide, and it's worth looking. They've got some really great resources talking specifically about a US context. But I want you to look at this video as kind of a case study. It's about 8 minutes long. And I want you to think about push and pull factors. What do you see in this girl's story that's a push factor or maybe a pull factor? And think through the acts and the means and the purpose. Can you identify those in this video? So give me a quick sec because I want to turn on this video. And I have to stop my share real quick and then change it to where you guys can have an optimized video. So give me 2 seconds. And we'll watch this video and then we'll talk about that.
Do you know Lacey? She was born in your town about 15 years ago. She lives in your neighborhood. She goes to your school. She's in your youth group.
I went to a private Christian school. Wednesdays I went to youth group from 7 to 9:30.
The day before her 13th birthday, a young boy known as a spotter approached Lacey in public. He invited her to her first party.
We were like, okay, well, we're going into 8th grade. We might as well get our first party out, you know, like, let's just go have fun.
That night would change Lacey's life forever.
I was sitting on the couch just listening to music. My friends were off dancing and stuff, and some really cute guy comes up and starts talking to me. And he was like, okay, well, maybe I'll see you around.
He made sure they ran into each other.
I was at Starbucks ordering a drink, and he had said, you know, hey, do you remember me? And I was like, nope, sorry, nope, don't remember you. And he's like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure I remember you.
He continued to stalk Lacey, learning her routine and approaching her multiple times in public places.
I went up to the Safeway, and we were buying groceries because my mom was at work, and I seen him there too.
Lacey had no idea these encounters were intentional. She thought it was fate, so she agreed to get together with him.
We started going on like little dates, fake dates. You know, I started thinking, you know, he really did like me.
This dating period was used to gain Lacey's trust.
What I'd do is I would go to school on the bus, and then right when I got off the bus, I'd kind of just leave and go meet him down the street or something.
Lacey continued to see her stalker, and he slowly began to manipulate her more and more.
He bought me a dress, and it was like really special to me. It was like, I felt like I was like a princess, like the queen or something. And he used to call me his queen.
Stop, go are the only signs she knows. She's trapped.
He kept saying that he needed money, and he was going to lose his cars and his house and stuff, and he's not going to have anywhere to go. So I was like, you know, I'll help you or whatever. And so we went to the strip club.
She had no idea that helping him meant he would rent her body out to lustful men of all ages, from all walks of life, night after night.
It's a night of heartache.
But Lacey's boyfriend groomed and manipulated her. He changed her name, her clothing, the way she felt about herself. He forced her into doing horrible, unthinkable things.
That night, my first night, I got in the car with 3 people. I puked for about 30 minutes. And I don't know, I just couldn't stop crying.
Often Lacey was forced to have sex with 10 different men in one night, 6 nights a week.
After a while, you kind of get used to it, like everything that goes around, it just doesn't seem out of the ordinary to you because you've been around it for a while.
It's a night of breaking, where she should be young. She is now a broken woman. It's a night of heart.
She's in your church. She's in your school. She's in your neighborhood.
Hope again. Are there any years? Anyone at all?
All right. So as we're looking at that, you can see some of those factors playing out. You can see the push and pull factors, some of her vulnerabilities, and you can also notice kind of the acts and the means and the purpose. And remember, she was a minor, so really the means doesn't matter. I think the thing, I've shared this a few times, and the thing that tends to come up for people when they first see it is, whoa, this is nothing like the movie Taken. I hate Hollywood movies about trafficking because they so often depict like an abduction or something like this, and that's just so rarely what actually happens. Coercion is really common. I've shown this to victims before who at the end of it said, oh my God, I'm a victim. Like they didn't even totally realize it because even in their heads, well, they weren't abducted. But there's this insidious process of grooming that we're going to get into. And I really love the way that this story represents that. I think they did a really, really good job of the video and really kind of blasting through some of the myths about what trafficking really is. And you see this girl who is romanced and who thinks that this boy loves her, and eventually is so isolated from her family and is so dependent upon him emotionally that she'll do the things that he asks her to do. And there's a ton of manipulation involved in that. So I want to keep this story in mind, but I also want to give you kind of a different story that's more set in the majority world. So in Indonesia, where we are, as I've worked in the red light district and been, sitting in brothels and hearing stories with women, there's a lot of really common stories, a lot of shared narrative. So the kind of the most common stereotypical story that we would hear in the brothels there is a girl that gets married at 13 or 14. So again, you see that intersection with child brides and child marriage that I mentioned before. So she gets married at 13 or 14. A year later, she has a baby. And then the husband takes off. And now she is stuck in a village with very little education. She has a cultural obligation, so there's a pull factor, the cultural obligation to take care of her parents and her child. And she has poverty, another pull factor. And now she is vulnerable. And a recruiter will come and will, through a series of events, will find this young woman, and they'll say, hey, look, Bali has an amazing economy. There's a lot of tourism there. It's beautiful. People come there. Why don't you come work in the hotel that my brother owns? And you can come work for my family's hotel, and you're going to make so much money, and you can take care of your family, you can take care of your kid, and you're going to love living in Bali. And in fact, we'll even buy your ferry ticket, and we will give you a cell phone, and you can just pay us back because you're going to make so much money that you can pay us back within a couple of months. But that way you have a phone so you can contact your family and you can video chat with your kid. And she'll say, okay, yeah, that seems like a really good idea. That seems like a good job and a good future for me and my family. And they will sign a contract. And then they will get on the ferry and they will arrive in Bali. They will get driven to a place and they will get there, and it will become very clear to them that this is actually not a hotel. It is a brothel, and they are going to be doing sex work. And if they put up a fight about it, which they generally do initially, they'll bring out the contract and say, you sign this. You're here. There's guards. You can't leave. And you sign this contract, and you already owe us money because we bought that cell phone for you and we bought you your ferry ticket. You have to work it off, and this is the way it's going to be worked off. And oftentimes there are guards and she can't leave. And even if she did, we've experienced that the police at this point haven't really done much about that unless we can prove that she's a minor. And if she is a minor, she's already been given fake documents because they've said, hey, it's a little complicated, so let's give you this fake ID card and we'll just take your old one for you and put it, over here. And so now she has no way to prove she's a minor, even if she found a way out. And she's required to do this sex work. And then over a course of time, the experience of degradation and just destruction to her self-worth because she's being forced to do sex work does all sorts of things. And I remember talking to a girl once who had actually managed to work off her debt, which happens sometimes in Bali, not always. She had managed to work off her debt and she was allowed to leave. And I asked her, so what are you going to do? Are you going to go home? And she said, no, I'm not. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to keep doing this. And I said, really? Why do you want to keep doing this? And she said, well, I have a daughter and she's kind of growing up the same way I did in the same place without opportunities. And if I can keep working and sending money home for her so she can stay in school like I wasn't able to do, someday she'll take care of me. But if I go home now, she's going to be here in 15 years and 10 years. So it's a really tragic and horrible thing. So that's really different from kind of the story that you see with Lacey. And I was talking to a colleague here in Orange County, California, and she was saying, when we're working with our foreign national victims, ones that are trafficked from overseas into the U.S., she said so often kind of the pathway for them is just poverty. They're trying to find a good job and they were deceived. With our American population in particular, it's this knot of messy factors. So a lot of them are from foster care or in the juvenile justice system, or, they have substance abuse problems. They have really messed up families and tons of childhood trauma. And she said, so even when we get them out and now we're in restorative services, we're not only dealing with the trafficking trauma, we're untangling this knot of what drove them in the first place. But all of these things, we are seeing this grooming pattern. So you have deception. So with Lacey's story, you see she's deceived by this Romeo guy, and she thinks that he loves her and that he wants to be with her and take care of her. In the Indonesia story, it's a deception about a job and what opportunities there are and what the job's going to be. And then you have a period of degradation. You saw it with her, and she talked about her first experience when she was exploited and how ashamed she was. And, she was throwing up and it was awful. And in the same way, you see that in Indonesia with the women there. And in Indonesia, there's a lot of emphasis on like female purity. Female virginity is really prized. And so, a lot of these girls, go in, and to have sex outside of marriage is like devastating. You never want to be associated with that. You lose your status. No one will marry you. So even for the women who somehow make it out, they never want to say what happened because it could cause so much shame in their family. So the degradation is there. And then you have the isolation. And sometimes that is a psychological isolation. A lot of times when you have a Romeo situation, the trafficker will spend a lot of time convincing the victim, your family doesn't love you. They don't care about you. No one really understands you but me. I'm the only one you can count on. And it really like messes with their head psychologically. Or they're actually geographically isolated. Maybe they're in another country or on another island. Their documents are stolen. So they're physically isolated and can't get help. But the ultimate goal, whether it's in the US or overseas, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, the goal is to dominate them. The goal is to destroy their sense of self, their sense of autonomy, their free will, and make them willingly submissive. One of the ways that I saw this really vividly in Indonesia when I was working in the red light district was that some of the women that had been trafficked for a very long time lived in their own apartments without guards, and they never ran. And it blew my mind in the beginning until I started understanding the process of grooming and even the process of trauma bonding, which we'll talk about in our next webinar. And basically what it boiled down to was early on, they had to be guarded because they would run. But after their will was broken and they were willingly submissive, the traffickers could literally put them in their own apartments and tell them when to show up for work, and they would. And that is kind of what it comes to, is that willing submission and the breaking of the human spirit. And so that's why in restorative care, it takes a long time and it's a really rough process, because you actually are restoring their humanity and their sense of dignity and free will, and reminding them that they actually do have choice. So it reminds me a little bit of the elephant thing, where you like put a stake with a rope on an elephant's leg, and they kind of will just do this, and you can take the stake out and they will still stay in that same area. And it's really the same thing that you see happening with people whose wills are broken through the process of trafficking. So kind of want to end up with, where do we go from here? What do we do? What do I do as just a citizen and a normal person? What can you do as somebody who cares about this issue, cares about your kids and the kids in your community? You want to see prevention, but you also want to see restoration. So let's talk about prevention, and let's talk about restorative and how kind of the average Joe and Jane can be a part of that. I mentioned I have kids too. I have 4 boys. So this is important to me on a personal level. But as we're talking about prevention, we're really looking at education and equipping and monitoring for our kids. So we know that early sex ed, sexual abuse education, and pornography education is critical in protecting children. Like, we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it early. Children can learn about trafficking even young. There are age appropriate ways to do that. And we need to equip them to respond. They should know how people access them. They should know how people use technology to access them, and they should be equipped to take care of themselves and guard themselves. They should know what to do if somebody wants to keep a secret, what to do if somebody wants to touch them inappropriately, what to do if somebody sends them a dick pic or asks for theirs. I don't think I'm supposed to say that word online, sorry. And then we also have to monitor them. We need to know who their friends are, and we need to know where they're going. And this can be really tough, especially if you have older kids, because we want to give them some autonomy. We want to give them some space and let them form their own identity. There's some really great software out there. We use it in our home that will alert you if something inappropriate or concerning comes up without you having to like read through all their texts and stuff. So I'll have my email up at the last slide. If you're interested in how do I talk to my kids about pornography, or how do I, is there good monitoring software, or how do I do this? Please, please, please send me an email. I have like a big old file full of great resources, and I'm happy to send those your way. So that's huge in prevention. As a parent, I am responsible and need to do my part in protecting my kids and the other kids in my life. We also have to think about our most vulnerable kids. Going back to those push factors, we know that foster kids and runaways and the LGBT community and kids with mental disabilities, like these are really vulnerable kids. So if we're not actively personally involved in those, are we supporting people who are? Maybe I'm not a foster parent, but am I supporting a foster family to make it easier for them? So we have to be responsible for that. And then the last couple are challenging, confronting culture. Following Brene Brown's work, I'm a big fan of Brene Brown. She talks about how women in the West are socialized into being submissive and prioritizing their looks. It is really, really easy to manipulate a girl who has been socialized to believe that the most important thing she does is to be submissive to men and to prioritize her looks. And on the flip side, from her work, she's shown that in the West, for males, we are really prioritizing violence and the lack of emotion and dominating women. And so if boys are being socialized into that, we are grooming them and we are grooming this situation. So as a parent of boys, it's my responsibility to teach them how to respect women, how to listen when somebody says no. My kids were messing around yesterday, just wrestling, and one of my kids said no, and the other one kind of kept going, and I immediately intervened and I said, no, if he says no, stop, you stop immediately. If somebody says don't touch my body, you don't touch their body. And as parents, we have to be confronting the culture, and it can be really challenging. And then finally, reckoning with the demand. I've been in a few meetings with the district attorney here in Orange County, as he's telling people, well, the demand is actually men in our community, and nobody wants to hear that. We want to think that the people that are buying children are people from outside, they're bad dudes coming in, but they're not. If you look at rescue operations, they will put lists, and it's fathers and husbands and teachers and lawyers and pastors and doctors and dentists. It's just normal men in the community who are part of the demand, and we have to get honest about that, and we have to start dealing with that as a community. And then finally, let's look at supporting restoration. So I always say, hey, you should care locally and you should care internationally. You should be involved in your community somehow, find an organization that's doing something right there, and be a part of that. And also look internationally. As I've worked in the US a little bit this year, I've 100,000 times thought, oh my goodness, if we just had 1/10 of these resources in Indonesia, it would change everything. So realize that in a lot of majority world countries, they're working with very little resources, very little training. There are not supportive social services. There's no such thing as foster care there. There's no such thing as trauma counseling in Indonesia. And so, trying to build from the ground up. So find an organization that you think is amazing and be their champion. Whether that means giving to them, whether that means just blasting everything on social media and all your friends know that you love this organization, find that organization and be their champion. Think through your skill sets. One of our volunteers is a CPA, and she does our bookkeeping, and she's amazing. It's a huge, huge gift to the organization. It saves us a ton of money and a ton of time that we would have to take away from projects to do this sort of thing. We have a web designer who volunteers their services. So think outside of the caregiving box. You probably have a skill set that's really needed by an organization. If you're a person of faith, pray. And then finally, think about your consuming. As a consumer, do you know where your clothes are coming from? Do you know where your shrimp is coming from? Do you know where your chocolate's coming from? What's that supply chain? Because if we're demanding cheap clothing, there's somebody somewhere not getting paid a fair wage to make it. So thinking through our ethical consumption is really, really important. So I'm going to stop there. We do have about 10 minutes, and we can wrap it up now if there's no questions. But if you have any questions about anything that I've said, or there's just something that I didn't hit that you're curious about, please go ahead and send me a message now, and we can go through those. And then I wanted to end with this slide so that everybody does have my email address in case you wanted to take this conversation offline, or if you had specific questions or you're looking for some of those resources I mentioned. Obviously, you can check out our website, darkbali.org. We actually have quite a bit of resources there and information on that website. And then, of course, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you want to stay connected with that. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will give that a few seconds to see if anything comes in. Otherwise, I'll just consider that I've done an excellent job and there are no questions at all, or you can just take them offline. So again, thank you guys for coming. Next week, same time, same Zoom link, we're going to be talking about the impact of trauma. And we will be looking specifically at how that happens, what the definitions of trauma are, and then what trauma does to our bodies and our minds. So thank you guys for coming. Find me online, and it was great. Talk to you later.